It was a night like any other, or at least it seemed that way at first. The protagonist, let's call him Alex, begins recounting the events that still haunt him to this day. He was in his bedroom with his brother Mark, both of them unwinding after a long day. The room was dimly lit, casting long shadows that flickered with the movement of the curtains as a gentle breeze flowed through the open window. They were chatting casually, sharing stories and jokes, when something inexplicably sinister occurred, forever changing the mundane comfort of their nightly routine. Suddenly, cutting through their conversation like a knife through silence came the sound, a high-pitched, eerie laughter that was instantly recognizable, yet completely out of place. It was the laugh of their sister's doll, a toy that only giggled when its chest button was pressed. But the doll wasn't anywhere near them. In fact, their sister's room was down the hall, and she wasn't home. The realization struck them both simultaneously, the cold creeping dread that what they were hearing wasn't possible, at least not under any normal circumstances. The laughter echoed in the room, distorted and menacing, as if the doll itself had taken on a life of its own. The air seemed to grow colder, and the shadows in the room deepened, stretching ominously toward the corners where the light from the bedside lamp couldn't reach. Alex's heart began to race, a primal fear gripping him as the sound persisted, each giggle more unsettling than the last. It wasn't just a toy anymore. It was something else, something that had crossed a boundary, intruding upon their reality with malevolent intent. Both Alex and Mark froze, their eyes locked on each other, searching for any rational explanation, but finding none. The laughter continued, echoing unnervingly in the stillness of the night. Alex's mind raced, trying to rationalize what he was hearing. Perhaps it was a malfunction, he thought, a short circuit in the doll's electronics. But deep down, he knew this explanation didn't hold up. The doll wasn't battery-operated. It required a firm press on its chest to make it laugh, and even then, the sound was never this loud, never this distorted. Something was terribly wrong. Driven by a mix of terror and an inexplicable compulsion to confront whatever was happening, Alex slowly rose from his bed, his legs trembling beneath him. He motioned for Mark to follow, though every instinct screamed at him to stay put, to pretend he hadn't heard anything. But the laughter was relentless, and so was the dread that filled the room like a thick fog, suffocating any sense of safety they had once felt. As they moved toward the door, the sound stopped abruptly, plunging the room into an oppressive silence that was almost worse than the laughter itself. The sudden stillness made the hairs on the back of Alex's neck stand on end, and a deep, gut-wrenching fear settled into the pit of his stomach. Whatever had triggered the doll's laughter was not done with them. It was merely waiting. Cautiously, they stepped out into the hallway, the dim light from their room casting long, unnerving shadows ahead of them. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels intentional, as though it's hiding something. They moved slowly toward their sister's room, where they knew the doll was supposed to be. Every step was heavy with dread, every creak of the floorboards amplified in the quiet of the night. When they reached the door, Alex hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the blood rushing in his ears. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as he gathered the courage to open the door. Mark stood behind him, equally terrified, but unwilling to let his brother face whatever was inside alone. Finally, Alex twisted the knob and pushed the door open. The room was dark, the moonlight filtering in through the window, casting pale light across the floor. His eyes immediately fell on the doll, sitting motionless on the bed, exactly where they had last seen it. But something was different, something was off. The atmosphere in the room was thick with an unseen presence, a heavy oppressive force that made it hard to breathe. The doll sat there, its button untouched, its eyes seemingly fixed on the door, as if it had been waiting for them. Alex felt a chill run down his spine, the fear gripping him tighter than ever. The room felt wrong, the kind of wrong that isn't just unsettling, but deeply, terrifyingly unnatural. The laughter may have stopped, but the dread remained, a constant, suffocating presence that promised more terror to come. As they stood there, paralyzed by fear, Alex realized with a sickening certainty that this was only the beginning. Whatever had triggered the doll's laughter had followed them, had seeped into their lives, turning something as innocent as a child's toy into an instrument of pure, unrelenting terror. And as they backed out of the room, closing the door behind them, they knew deep down that they had unwittingly opened the door to something much darker, something that would haunt them for nights to come. As Alex continues to narrate the events that unfolded after that horrifying night, he makes a deliberate choice to change the names of everyone involved. He explains this decision with an unnerving calmness, a stark contrast to the terror he felt during the incidents. The reason for altering the names, he says, isn't just for privacy, it's something much darker. Alex pauses, as if weighing his words carefully, then reveals the true reason: fear. He recounts how, after that night, strange things began to happen, not just in the house, but to the people who were there. It started small, almost imperceptibly: misplaced objects, odd dreams, feelings of being watched. But these occurrences quickly escalated, becoming more frequent and intense. Alex describes how Mark, his brother, began experiencing terrible nightmares, visions of the doll standing at the foot of his bed, its eyes glowing in the darkness. The visions were so vivid, so real, that Mark would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, unable to shake the feeling that the doll was still there, watching him. Alex's sister, whose doll had become the catalyst for this nightmare, was affected in a different way. She started speaking in her sleep, mumbling incoherent words that seemed to be in a language none of them recognized. On more than one occasion, Alex would find her sitting upright in bed, her eyes open but unseeing, her mouth moving, as if she were conversing with someone or something in the room. The fear that gripped Alex in those moments was unlike anything he had ever felt. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown, it was the fear of losing control, of watching his family fall apart under the weight of an invisible, malevolent force. The most disturbing change, however, was in the doll itself. Alex and Mark tried to get rid of it, hoping that doing so would put an end to the terror. They threw it away, burned it, even buried it. But no matter what they did, the doll always found its way back into the house. It would appear in the most unexpected places, on the kitchen table, in the bathroom, once even on Alex's pillow when he came back from school. Each time it returned, it looked more worn, more sinister, as if whatever was inside it was growing stronger, feeding off their fear. As these events unfolded, Alex realized that the entity attached to the doll wasn't just haunting them. It was trying to erase their identities, to rewrite their lives. It started with subtle manipulations, photos in their house where faces were blurred, documents where names were altered, but soon it became more personal. Alex recalls how he woke up one morning and found his name had been scratched out on his school notebooks, replaced with something unrecognizable, something that looked more like a symbol than a name. The same happened to Mark and their sister. Their names, their identities, were slowly being erased, replaced by something unknown, something terrifying. In an attempt to protect themselves, Alex decided to change their names in the story he's telling now, a desperate measure to hide from whatever had taken hold of their lives. He admits that even now, as he shares his story, he feels like he's being watched, that the entity might still be searching for them, waiting for the right moment to strike again. By changing their names, he hopes to create some distance, to throw the entity off their trail, if only for a little while. But deep down, he knows it's only a matter of time before it finds them again. The act of changing their names is more than just a precaution. It's a symbol of their struggle to hold onto their humanity, to resist being consumed by the darkness that has infiltrated their lives. Alex describes the horror of seeing his family's faces change subtly over time, their features becoming less distinct, their expressions more hollow, as if the entity was slowly draining the life out of them. He talks about the moment he looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back at him, person who no longer looked like Alex, but like something else entirely. The terror of losing not just their lives, but their very selves became a constant, gnawing fear. The idea that they could be erased, forgotten, and replaced by something unknown, something malevolent, was more horrifying than any physical threat. It was a psychological nightmare, a slow, creeping dread that left them questioning their reality, their memories, their very existence. As Alex concludes this part of the story, he leaves the audience with a chilling thought that maybe, just maybe, the entity had already succeeded in some way. That by telling the story, by changing the names, he might have unwittingly allowed it to gain more power, to spread its influence even further. The fear that this entity could be listening, watching, waiting, is a fear that Alex cannot escape, and one that he passes on to the viewer, leaving them with an unsettling sense that the story is far from over. After the terrifying incidents with the doll, Alex became obsessed with finding answers. The fear that had gripped him was overwhelming, but even more than the fear, it was the need to understand what had happened that drove him. One night, while lying in bed unable to sleep, he decided to search the internet for similar experiences. He typed in keywords that he never thought he would: haunted doll, supernatural experiences, unexplained laughter, and found himself diving deeper into the dark recesses of the web. It was in these shadowy corners that Alex discovered a thread on Reddit that immediately caught his attention. It was buried in a subreddit dedicated to the paranormal, a place where people shared stories that ranged from eerie to outright terrifying. The post that drew him in was titled, "The Laughing Doll, a Warning." The title alone sent a shiver down his spine, but it was the content that truly unnerved him. The post detailed an experience eerily similar to his own. The author, who remained anonymous, described how they, too, had encountered a doll that laughed on its own, seemingly possessed by a malevolent force. As Alex read through the post, his heart pounded in his chest. The more he read, the more he felt a creeping sense of dread. The author spoke of strange occurrences that began after the doll started laughing, objects moving on their own, the sound of footsteps in empty hallways, whispers in the night that seemed to come from nowhere. But it was the final part of the post that filled Alex with a cold, paralyzing fear. The author warned that once the doll's laughter started, it meant that something had taken notice of you, something that was not easily dismissed. They urged anyone who experienced this to get rid of the doll immediately, to burn it, bury it, do anything to destroy it. Because if you didn't, it would come back. And each time it returned, it would be stronger, its influence more pervasive, until it had completely taken over. The post ended with a cryptic message. You can't hide from it. It will find you. And when it does, it won't just be the doll anymore. It will be everywhere, Alex sat back in his chair, his hands trembling. The similarities between his experience and the one described in the post were too close to be mere coincidence. But there was something more. Something in the way the post was written, as if it was speaking directly to him, warning him. He scrolled down to check the comments, but there were none. It was as if no one else had seen this post, or maybe no one had dared to respond. Despite the fear gnawing at him, Alex felt compelled to follow the clues laid out in the post. He started by searching the username of the person who made it, hoping to find more information. But when he clicked on the profile, he found that it no longer existed, deleted, as if it had never been there. This sent another wave of unease through him. How could a post be so detailed, so specific, yet lead to nothing? Undeterred, Alex began to investigate the details mentioned in the post, the location the author spoke of, the events they described. He found himself piecing together a puzzle that seemed to have no clear picture, just fragments of horror that didn't quite fit together. As he delved deeper, strange things began to happen around him. His computer would freeze at odd moments, the screen flickering with static before returning to normal. He started receiving anonymous messages, cryptic warnings that seemed to echo the same words from the Reddit post, "You can't hide." One night, as he was researching late into the evening, his computer abruptly shut down. When he turned it back on, he found an unfamiliar file on his desktop, untitled with no clear origin. He hesitated before clicking on it, his instincts telling him that whatever was inside would only deepen the nightmare he was already living. But curiosity, or perhaps some darker force, drove him to open it. The file contained a single image, blurry, almost unrecognizable at first, but as he stared at it, the image became clearer. It was a picture of his own bedroom, taken from an angle that suggested it was shot from inside the room. Alex's blood ran cold. He hadn't taken this picture, and no one else should have been in his room. His eyes were drawn to a small detail in the photo. The corner of the bed, where the doll was sitting, its eyes glowing faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if it had been watching him all along. Terror gripped him as he realized the implications. The entity wasn't just connected to the doll. It had infiltrated his life, his space, his very sense of reality. And now, it was making itself known, taunting him through the very technology he had hoped would help him understand it. The messages didn't stop there. Over the next few days, Alex found more files on his computer, short cryptic videos showing glimpses of shadowy figures, distorted audio clips of laughter that echoed the doll's sinister giggle. Each new file left him more shaken, more convinced that he was being hunted by something beyond his comprehension. As the line between the online mystery and his real-life horror continued to blur, Alex began to realize that the entity wasn't just haunting him through the doll. It had found a way to exist in the digital realm, to reach out to him through the very tools he was using to seek answers. The more he searched, the more he found, and the more he found, the closer it seemed to come. The post that started it all had vanished, just as mysteriously as it had appeared. But its influence lingered, a dark presence that clung to Alex's every move. The warnings it contained now echoed in his mind, no longer just words on a screen, but a grim reality that he couldn't escape. You can't hide from it. It will find you. And deep down, Alex knew it already had. The days following the discovery of the mysterious online posts were filled with an ever-growing sense of dread for Alex. The warnings, the cryptic messages, and the strange files on his computer all pointed to something far beyond his understanding, something that was not just haunting his thoughts, but beginning to encroach upon his reality. He tried to push it out of his mind, tried to convince himself that it was all just a series of coincidences, that his imagination was running wild. But deep down, he knew better. The presence was real, and it was getting closer. One night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, sleep evaded him. The house was silent, the kind of silence that feels unnaturally heavy, as if the world is holding its breath. Alex's mind was racing, replaying the events of the past few days over and over. His eyes flicked to the clock on his bedside table, 3:07 a.m. The witching hour, he thought with a shiver, the time when the veil between the living and the dead is said to be the thinnest. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a sound that made Alex's blood run cold. A faint, almost imperceptible creak, like the sound of someone slowly opening a door. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding in his chest, straining to hear over the rush of blood in his ears. The house was still. No other noises followed. He told himself it was just the house settling, the kind of sound that old buildings make in the dead of night. But the fear that gripped him wouldn't let go. He lay back down, trying to convince himself that it was nothing. But then he heard it again, a soft creak, followed by the barely audible sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. They seemed to be coming from the hallway, just outside his bedroom door. Alex froze, his breath catching in his throat. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, to his horror, the doorknob to his room began to turn slowly, as if someone on the other side was hesitating, deciding whether or not to enter. The door creaked open just a crack, enough for Alex to see into the dark hallway beyond. There was nothing there, no shadow, no figure, just the inky blackness of the corridor. But the sense of a presence was overwhelming, a cold, oppressive force that seemed to fill the room, making it hard to breathe. Alex's heart was racing, his body paralyzed with fear, every instinct screaming at him to run, to get out of the house. But he couldn't move. He was frozen in place, staring at the door, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. And then it happened. From the darkness of the hallway came a sound that Alex would never forget. A soft, chilling giggle, the same distorted laughter that had haunted him since that night with the doll. But this time, it wasn't just a recording or a trick of the mind. This time, it was real, echoing through the silent house, growing louder, closer. The door creaked open a little more, and Alex's eyes widened in terror as he saw a shadow pass across the threshold. It was the shape of a small figure, barely visible in the darkness, but its presence was undeniable. The giggling continued, now accompanied by the soft rustle of fabric, as if the figure was moving closer to the bed. Alex wanted to scream, to call out for help, but his voice was caught in his throat, trapped by the fear that gripped him. The figure moved into the room, and as it did, the dim light from the street outside illuminated it, just enough for Alex to see. It was the doll, his sister's doll, standing on its own, its head tilted to one side, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The sight of it sent a jolt of pure terror through Alex, but he still couldn't move, couldn't look away. The doll's mouth was open, the source of the eerie, distorted laughter that filled the room. It took a step forward, its tiny feet scraping against the wooden floor, then another, moving closer to the bed. Alex felt the air around him grow colder, the chill seeping into his bones. The doll's laughter was deafening now, filling his mind, drowning out all other thoughts. He could feel its eyes on him, unblinking as it approached the edge of the bed. And then, just as it reached him, the laughter stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse, the absence of sound leaving a void that was quickly filled by a deep, primal fear. The doll stood still, its head tilted up, looking directly at Alex. In that moment, he felt something brush against his leg, cold, clammy, like the touch of death itself. The sensation broke the paralysis that had held him in place, and he jerked back, scrambling out of bed, his heart pounding in his chest. He backed away from the doll, his eyes never leaving it, but it didn't move. It just stood there, its eyes glowing faintly, its mouth still open in a silent scream. Alex's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he backed into the corner of the room, as far from the doll as he could get. He could feel the walls closing in around him, the darkness pressing down, suffocating, but the doll remained motionless, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. For what felt like an eternity, they remained like that. Alex huddled in the corner, the doll standing at the foot of the bed watching him. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Alex found the strength to move. He bolted for the door, throwing it open and racing down the hallway. He didn't stop running until he was outside, the cold night air hitting his face like a slap, bringing him back to reality. He stood there panting, his heart racing, looking back at the house. The lights were all off, the windows dark, but he knew deep down that the doll was still in there waiting. The encounter left Alex shaken to his core. It wasn't just the doll that terrified him, but what it represented, the undeniable proof that something was haunting him, something beyond his comprehension. He had crossed a line that night, delving too deep into a darkness that now refused to let him go. The fear of what might happen next consumed him, leaving him paranoid, always looking over his shoulder, always expecting the doll, or something worse, to be there, waiting to strike. The first encounter was only the beginning, and Alex knew with a sinking dread that the worst was yet to come. After that first chilling encounter, Alex's life descended into a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. The doll was no longer just an eerie toy. It had become the epicenter of a malevolent force that was slowly, methodically, tightening its grip on him and his home. The terror that had once been sporadic and subtle now became a constant gnawing presence, a dark shadow that loomed over every moment, every breath. In the days that followed, the doll appeared in different parts of the house, always in places where Alex least expected it. It was no longer confined to his sister's room or his own. It was everywhere. He would find it sitting at the kitchen table in the morning, its empty eyes staring straight ahead, as if it had been waiting for him. Sometimes it would be on the living room couch, slumped over in a disturbingly lifelike pose, or perched at the foot of his bed when he returned from school. Each time, the sight of it sent a fresh wave of dread coursing through him. But no matter how many times he tried to get rid of it, throwing it in the trash, locking it in the attic, it always came back, as if it was mocking his efforts to escape. The activity around the house escalated quickly. What started as faint noises, creaks, whispers, the occasional knock, soon became unmistakable signs of something far more sinister. Objects began to move on their own, often in front of Alex's eyes. He would place his keys on the counter only to watch in horror as they slid across the surface by an unseen force and fell to the floor. The lights flickered constantly, plunging rooms into darkness at the most inopportune moments, leaving Alex alone with whatever was lurking in the shadows. But it wasn't just the physical disturbances that tormented him. It was the growing sense that the doll, or whatever inhabited it, was watching him, learning from him, and anticipating his every move. He began to feel eyes on him even when he was alone, a cold, invasive presence that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. At night, he would lie in bed, unable to sleep, listening to the sound of footsteps pacing outside his door, the soft creaking of floorboards that seemed to come closer and closer, but would stop just short of entering his room. It was as if the entity was toying with him, feeding off his fear, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. One particularly terrifying night, Alex was jolted awake by a loud crash from downstairs. His heart raced as he sat up in bed, straining to hear through the oppressive silence that followed. The crash was followed by a series of thuds, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. His mind raced, torn between staying hidden under the covers and the primal urge to investigate. But the fear was too great, too suffocating to ignore. He grabbed his phone, using the faint glow of the screen to light his way as he crept down the stairs. The house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that felt intentional, like it was hiding something terrible just out of sight. Alex's hand shook as he reached the bottom of the stairs, his eyes scanning the darkened hallway. The source of the noise was immediately apparent. The kitchen chairs were overturned, scattered across the floor, as if they had been thrown in a fit of rage. But it was what lay in the center of the chaos that made Alex's blood run cold. The doll was there, sitting upright in the middle of the floor, surrounded by the wreckage. Its head was tilted up, its eyes fixed on the doorway, as if it had been waiting for him to arrive. But there was something different about it now. Its face, once smooth and expressionless, was now twisted into a grotesque smile. A smile that shouldn't have been possible, given the doll's design. The sight of it filled Alex with a sickening dread, a deep, visceral fear that clawed at his insides. As he stood frozen in the doorway, the lights in the kitchen flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness before flooding it with harsh, unnatural light. The sudden change left Alex disoriented, his vision swimming as the world seemed to tilt around him. And then, Sinister started again. Low, guttural, almost inhuman. It echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls, growing louder and more menacing with each passing second. The doll's mouth moved, just slightly, as if it was struggling to form words. But what came out wasn't a coherent sentence, just a series of distorted sounds that barely resembled human speech. The laughter continued, a horrific symphony of madness that filled Alex with a terror he'd never known before. It was then that he realized the doll wasn't just a vessel for the entity. It was becoming a part of it, evolving into something more dangerous, more powerful. Alex's instinct screamed at him to run, to get as far away from the house as possible, but his feet wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear, as the doll began to inch closer, dragging itself across the floor with jerky, unnatural movements. The laughter grew louder, more frenzied, as if it was feeding off his fear, growing stronger with each beat of his racing heart. In a desperate bid to break free from the terror that held him captive, Alex forced himself to move, to flee. He turned and bolted back up the stairs, his footsteps pounding on the wooden steps as the laughter chased him down the hallway. He could feel it right behind him, a cold breath on the back of his neck as he slammed the door to his room shut and threw himself against it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, there was silence, an oppressive, suffocating silence that pressed down on him from all sides. And then, just as he started to think he was safe, there was a knock at the door. Not a loud, aggressive knock, but a soft, almost polite tapping, like a visitor arriving at a friend's house. Alex's blood ran cold as he realized the knock was coming from the other side of the door, from inside his room. He turned slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. and saw the doll standing by his bed, its head cocked to one side, its eyes fixed on him with that same grotesque smile. The tapping continued, echoing through the room, as the doll slowly lifted its arm, pointing directly at him. It was a gesture of finality, a clear sign that there was no escape, no hiding from what was coming. The room grew colder, the temperature plummeting as the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, consuming the light. The fear that gripped Alex was overwhelming, a suffocating force that made it hard to breathe, to think. He backed away, his mind reeling, but the doll remained where it was, its presence filling the room with an unbearable sense of dread. That night, the horror reached its peak, a crescendo of terror that left Alex shattered, unable to distinguish between reality and nightmare. The entity had grown stronger, more invasive, and it wasn't going to stop until it had consumed everything: his sanity, his life, his very soul. The escalation of horror was complete, and as Alex huddled in the corner of his room, he knew with a sickening certainty that there was no way out. The doll, the entity, had won, and now it was only a matter of time before it claimed him completely. After the night of relentless terror, Alex found himself spiraling into a state of paranoia and despair. Sleep became a distant memory, replaced by nights filled with the ominous sounds of the doll's laughter and the creeping sense that something far worse was yet to come. He knew he had to find answers, some explanation for the horrors that had overtaken his life, before he lost his sanity entirely. Desperation drove him to dig deeper into the mystery, to uncover the truth that had eluded him for so long. One day, exhausted but determined, Alex decided to revisit the online forums where his nightmare had first begun. He scoured every thread, every post, looking for anything that might offer a clue, a connection, something he had missed before. Hours passed as he combed through the dark corners of the internet, the oppressive feeling of dread growing with each fruitless search. And then, buried deep within a forgotten thread, he found something that made his blood run cold. It was a post from the same anonymous user who had warned about the laughing doll. But this one was different. The tone was more frantic, more desperate, as if the person writing it was on the edge of madness. The post spoke of a ritual, an ancient, forbidden practice that had been used to trap malevolent spirits within objects, dolls, mirrors, even paintings. The ritual was dangerous, the post warned, because it didn't just bind the spirit, it gave it power, a connection to the living that it could use to grow stronger, to escape its confines. As Alex read on, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, each revelation more horrifying than the last. The doll wasn't just haunted. It was a vessel, a prison for something far darker. The entity that had been bound to the doll was not just any spirit, but one that had been vengeful and violent in life. The ritual had trapped it, but it had also enraged it, fueling its desire for revenge against anyone who crossed its path. The doll's laughter was a sign that the spirit was awakening, that it was testing the limits of its prison, looking for weaknesses, cracks through which it could escape. The post detailed the origin of the entity, a woman accused of witchcraft centuries ago, condemned by her own village for crimes she may or may not have committed. The villagers, driven by fear and superstition, had tortured her, forcing her to confess to acts of black magic. In her final moments, she cursed the town, vowing that her spirit would return to exact vengeance on those who wronged her. Her dying words were filled with such hatred, such malice, that they became a beacon, attracting dark forces to her cause. The ritual that followed was meant to contain her spirit, to stop her from carrying out her curse, but instead, it had bound her to the doll, turning it into a conduit for her wrath. As Alex read the details of the curse, he felt a sickening realization settle over him. The strange occurrences, the doll's laughter, the escalating horror. It was all part of the curse, the spirit's way of breaking free, of continuing the vengeance she had sworn centuries ago. And Alex, by his mere proximity to the doll, had become the latest target of her wrath. The post ended with a chilling warning. Once the spirit had fully awakened, there would be no stopping it. The doll would no longer be needed as a vessel. The spirit would be free to roam, to possess, to kill. The only hope, the post suggested, was to perform a counter-ritual, one that could sever the bond between the spirit and the doll. But the ritual was dangerous, requiring precise steps and rare ingredients. One mistake, and the spirit could be unleashed instead of contained. Alex felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he read the instructions. The counter-ritual required him to confront the spirit directly, to enter a state of deep meditation where he could communicate with it, draw it out. He would need to use the doll as a focus to force the spirit to reveal itself. Then, using a series of incantations and symbols, he would have to break the bond, destroy the doll, and trap the spirit in an object that could be buried or destroyed. But there was a catch. If Alex's resolve wavered, if his fear overwhelmed him during the ritual, the spirit would sense it, and it would turn the ritual against him. The spirit would escape, and Alex would become its first victim, his body twisted into a vessel for the entity's hatred and anger. The thought of confronting the entity terrified Alex, but what choice did he have? The spirit was growing stronger, its influence spreading beyond the doll, affecting the very fabric of his reality. He could feel it watching him, manipulating events, feeding off his fear. If he didn't act soon, it would be too late. The final piece of the revelation came in the form of an old book, one that Alex found referenced in another obscure thread. The book, titled The Bound Spirits, was said to contain detailed accounts of the ritual used to bind spirits, as well as the counter-rituals that could undo them. It was rare, almost impossible to find, but Alex was relentless. After days of searching, he managed to locate a copy in a dusty, forgotten section of a local library, hidden away from prying eyes. The book was ancient, its pages yellowed with age, the ink faded, but still legible. As Alex flipped through it, he found the section that matched the ritual described in the post. The details were even more horrifying than he had imagined. Descriptions of spirits that had broken free, leaving trails of death and madness in their wake. The rituals were complex, involving blood, fire, and symbols that had to be drawn with utmost precision. One mistake, the book warned, and the ritual would fail, unleashing the full fury of the spirit. But the book also held something else, an account of someone who had successfully performed the counter-ritual. The person, a scholar who had studied the occult, had managed to trap a spirit in a mirror, sealing it away for eternity. The process had been grueling, almost fatal, but it had worked. The scholar's words, however, were laced with a final warning. Even when trapped, the spirit could still exert influence. It could whisper through the mirror, corrupting those who gazed into it, drawing them into its darkness. Armed with this knowledge, Alex knew what he had to do. The final revelation was clear. The spirit would not stop until it was either destroyed or free to unleash its vengeance. The doll was the key, the focus of its power, but it was also the only thing holding the spirit in place. The time had come to confront the entity, to break the bond before it broke him. The task ahead was fraught with danger, but there was no turning back. As he prepared for the ritual, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that the spirit was already aware of his plans, that it was watching, waiting for the moment to strike. The house felt more oppressive than ever, the air thick with the presence of something dark and malevolent. The doll remained in its usual place, but its eyes seemed to follow him wherever he went, its grotesque smile a constant reminder of the horror that awaited. The revelation had given Alex the knowledge he needed, but it had also brought with it a new level of terror. The entity was no longer just a vague threat. It was a force of nature, an ancient evil that had been waiting centuries to exact its revenge. And now it was Alex's turn to face it, to confront the darkness that had taken over his life, and to either banish it forever or become its next victim. The final battle was imminent, and as Alex steeled himself for what was to come, he knew that whatever happened, he would never be the same again. The night of the ritual arrived with an air of inevitability, as if the universe itself had been leading Alex to this moment all along. The house, once a place of comfort, had become a prison. Each creak of the floorboards and flicker of the lights, a reminder of the malevolent force that had taken root within its walls. The doll sat in the center of his room, its presence suffocating, as if the air itself had grown thick and heavy with dread. Alex could feel the weight of the entity's gaze on him, a cold, piercing stare that bore into his very soul. There was no escape now, only the final confrontation. Alex had spent the day preparing, gathering the materials and focusing his mind on the task ahead. The ritual required precision, both in the physical preparations and in his mental state. He drew the necessary symbols on the floor with chalk, their intricate designs forming a protective circle around the doll. Candles were placed at each point of the circle, their flames flickering uncertainly as if they too sensed the presence of something dark and unnatural. The book, The Bound Spirits, lay open beside him, the pages detailing the steps he would need to follow. His hands trembled as he read through the instructions one last time, his heart pounding in his chest. The incantations were in a language he didn't understand, their harsh syllables feeling foreign and dangerous on his tongue. But there was no room for error. One mistake, and the spirit would break free, unleashing its full fury upon him. As the clock struck midnight, Alex knew it was time. The witching hour, the moment when the veil between the worlds of the living and the dead was at its thinnest. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows lengthening and deepening until they seemed almost solid, pressing in on him from all sides. The doll's eyes gleamed in the candlelight, its grotesque smile a mockery of innocence. Alex could feel the entity's anticipation, its hunger for release, and the realization that it was ready for whatever came next. With a deep breath, Alex began the ritual. He recited the incantations, his voice trembling at first but growing stronger as he continued. The words seemed to resonate in the air, creating a palpable tension that made his skin crawl. The flames of the candles flickered violently, as if buffeted by an unseen wind, casting twisted shadows across the room. The protective circle began to glow faintly, the symbols shimmering with a strange, otherworldly light. As Alex chanted, he could feel the presence of the entity growing stronger, its attention fully focused on him. The air crackled with energy, a low, throbbing hum that vibrated through his bones. The doll began to move, its limbs twitching and jerking as if something inside it was trying to break free. The sight filled Alex with a deep, visceral terror, but he forced himself to continue, knowing that stopping now would mean certain death. The room grew darker, the shadows swallowing the light as the entity made its presence known. Alex's breath came in short, panicked gasps as the temperature plummeted, frost forming on the windows and creeping across the floor. The doll's movements became more frantic, its head twisting unnaturally on its neck, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It began to laugh, a low guttural sound that echoed through the room, filling Alex with a sense of impending doom. As the laughter grew louder, more distorted, the protective circle began to waver, the light flickering as if it might go out at any moment. The entity was fighting back, testing the limits of its prison, pushing against the boundaries that held it. Alex could feel the strain, the energy in the room building to a breaking point. His fear threatened to overwhelm him, but he couldn't stop now. He was so close. The book instructed him to confront the spirit directly, to force it to reveal itself before completing the ritual. This was the most dangerous part, the moment when the entity would be at its most powerful, most desperate. Alex took a deep breath and called out to the spirit, his voice trembling with fear and determination. "Show yourself," he commanded, his words echoing in the darkness. "I know who you are. I know what you want, but you won't take me." The room fell deathly silent, the only sound the frantic beating of Alex's heart. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden, violent force, the room was plunged into complete darkness. The candles were snuffed out, the protective circle dissolving into nothingness as the entity unleashed its full power. Alex was thrown backward, crashing into the wall with a force that knocked the breath out of him. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes straining to see in the pitch black. But there was nothing, only the oppressive darkness and the sound of the doll's laughter, now deafening, filling his mind with terror. Then, slowly, the darkness began to take shape. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and twisted, its form shifting and writhing as if made of smoke and shadow. The entity had taken on a physical form, its eyes burning with a cold blue light that pierced through the darkness. It was the woman from the curse, her features distorted by centuries of hatred and rage, her body a grotesque mockery of the human form. Her mouth twisted into a snarl, and she spoke in a voice that was both a whisper and a scream, the words tearing through Alex's mind. "You cannot stop me," she hissed, her voice filled with venom. "You are nothing. I will break free, and when I do, I will destroy everything you love." The terror that gripped Alex was overwhelming, paralyzing, but he knew he couldn't give in. The ritual wasn't complete. There was still a chance to trap the spirit, to banish it forever. He forced himself to his feet, his body trembling with fear and exhaustion, and began the final incantation. The words were almost impossible to speak, the entity's presence pressing down on him, suffocating him. But he pushed through, focusing on the light that still flickered deep within him. The entity screeched in fury, its form distorting as it tried to break free from the circle of light that was forming around it. Alex could feel the strain, the immense power that the spirit was wielding. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The air crackled with energy, the symbols on the floor glowing with a blinding light as the ritual reached its climax. With a final, desperate push, Alex completed the incantation. The room exploded with light, the force of it throwing the entity backward, its scream of rage and terror echoing through the house. The doll shattered into pieces, the binding object destroyed, and the entity was pulled into the light, its form dissolving into nothingness as it was banished from the world of the living. For a moment, there was only silence, the house eerily still in the aftermath of the battle. Alex collapsed to the floor, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The entity was gone, its presence banished. the house returned to its former state of quiet emptiness. But the relief was short-lived as Alex realized the true cost of what had just occurred. The house was now empty, yes, but it was also scarred. The ritual had torn through the fabric of reality, leaving behind a darkness that would never fully heal. The entity may have been banished, but its presence would linger, a shadow over the house, over Alex, forever. He had won, but at what cost? The terror, the fear, the memories. They would never leave him. The darkness had touched him, marked him, and he knew that he would carry it with him for the rest of his life. As he lay there on the cold floor, the remnants of the ritual fading around him, Alex understood that the real battle had only just begun. The entity was gone, but the fear remained, an ever-present reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edges of reality, waiting for the next moment of weakness to strike. In the days following the climactic ritual, Alex struggled to regain a sense of normalcy, but the weight of what he had experienced lingered like a dark cloud over his life. The house, once a place of comfort and safety, now felt like a hollow shell, its walls echoing with the memories of the terror that had unfolded within them. The entity was gone, banished as far as he could tell, but the darkness it had brought with it remained, an invisible stain that clung to every corner, every shadow. Alex's sleep was plagued by nightmares, vivid and unsettling, filled with the echoes of the doll's laughter and the twisted, snarling face of the entity. In his dreams, he would find himself back in the house, the walls closing in on him, the air thick with the presence of something unseen, but undeniably there. He would wake in a cold sweat, heart pounding, the sense of dread lingering long after the images had faded. The line between dreams and reality began to blur, leaving him in a constant state of anxiety, never sure if he was truly awake or still trapped in the nightmare. During the day, the house was eerily quiet, but it was a silence that felt wrong, unnatural. The slightest noise, a creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the wind outside, would send Alex's heart racing, his mind flashing back to the horrors he had faced. He started to notice things that weren't quite right. Objects slightly out of place, shadows that seemed to move on their own, fleeting glimpses of something just out of the corner of his eye. He would tell himself it was just his imagination, the lingering effects of the trauma he had endured, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the entity had left something behind, a piece of itself that still haunted the house. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the house in a dim twilight glow, Alex sat alone in the living room, staring blankly at the television. The flickering light of the screen did little to dispel the darkness that seemed to creep in from the edges of the room, the shadows growing longer, more oppressive as the minutes ticked by. He tried to focus on the noise, on anything other than the silence that threatened to consume him, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the ritual, to the entity, to the feeling that something was still wrong. The sense of being watched, which had plagued him for so long, returned with a vengeance. He could feel it, that cold, invasive presence, like a pair of eyes boring into the back of his skull. He turned off the television, the sudden silence amplifying the tension in the room. The darkness pressed in closer, the shadows twisting and writhing as if alive, and Alex knew he wasn't alone. Slowly, he turned to face the room, his breath catching in his throat as his eyes scanned the darkened corners. At first, there was nothing, just the empty room, filled with the dim light of the fading day. But then, in the far corner, where the shadows were deepest, he saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible figure, standing just beyond the reach of the light of them. It was the doll, Or rather, it looked like the doll, but twisted and distorted, its form flickering as if it were caught between two realities. Its eyes glowed faintly, the same cold blue light that had haunted Alex's nightmares. And its mouth was curled into that grotesque smile he'd come to dread. The sight of it sent a wave of terror crashing over him, his body frozen in place, unable to move or even scream. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Alex could feel its presence, its intent. It was watching him, waiting, as if it knew something he didn't. The air in the room grew colder, the shadows stretching out toward him, and Alex felt the familiar grip of fear tightening around his chest. The entity was gone. He had banished it, he was sure of it, but this, whatever it was, had remained, a remnant of the darkness that had invaded his life. He blinked, and the figure was gone, the room returning to its previous state of unsettling quiet. But the fear remained, a gnawing sense of dread that told him this wasn't over, that it would never be over. The entity had left a piece of itself behind, a shadow that would follow him wherever he went, a constant reminder of the terror he had faced. Desperate for answers, Alex turned to the book once more, hoping to find some explanation, some way to rid himself of this lingering presence. He read through the pages with a growing sense of despair, realizing that the entity's curse was more insidious than he had imagined. The spirit, even in death, had left a mark on him, a connection that could never be fully severed. The doll had been destroyed, the spirit banished, but the darkness it had brought with it had taken root in Alex's soul, feeding off his fear, his despair. The book spoke of such curses, ancient and powerful, designed not just to torment but to ensnare, to draw the living into the same darkness that had consumed the spirit. The only way to truly escape, it warned, was to let go of the fear, to sever the emotional ties that the entity had used to bind itself to him. But how could he? The fear was all-consuming, a constant presence that had become a part of him, as much a part of his reality as the very air he breathed. As the days turned into weeks, Alex found himself slowly unraveling, the constant presence of the entity's shadow wearing away at his sanity. He became withdrawn, paranoid, jumping at every sound, every flicker of light. The house, once a place of safety, now felt like a trap, a cage he couldn't escape. The figure appeared more frequently, always at the edge of his vision, always just out of reach. It never spoke, never moved, but its presence was enough to drive Alex to the brink of madness. One night, as the darkness closed in around him, Alex made a decision. He couldn't live like this anymore, couldn't continue to be haunted by the remnants of a curse that had nearly destroyed him. He needed to leave, to get as far away from the house, from the memories, from the shadow that followed him. He packed a bag, grabbed his keys, and fled, not knowing where he was going, only that he had to get away. But as he drove through the dark, empty streets, the sense of dread didn't lessen. The shadows in the corners of his vision didn't disappear. The figure, the twisted, grotesque remnant of the doll, was still there, watching, waiting. Alex realized with a sinking feeling that there was no escape. The entity's shadow had attached itself to him, bound to him in a way that couldn't be undone by distance or time. Testin and Mostunsi, Zani, introduced Jarasas Tinctus Duda,